Welcome to the Supply Geek podcast, the show that turns shipping containers and glossy corporate advertising into real stories worth sharing. I'm your host, Ben Thornton-Jones, and whether you're a supply chain geek like me, a conscious consumer, or just someone who's always wondered how the palm oil ends up in your favourite chocolate spread, you are in the right place. Each episode, we unpack the hidden stories behind the stuff we use and the things we do every day, from, as today, palm oil plantations, but to the milk supply chain, from cargo ships to carbon emissions. We're not just about moving goods, we're here to move minds. So grab your map of the world, adjust your safety vest of skepticism, and let's dive into the weird and wonderful world of supply chains. Let's get geeky. My guest today, and number one palm oil geek, is Judith Murdoch. Judith, thank you so much for being part of the podcast. I hope you wear that badge I've given you with pride. Palm oil, I've really been looking forward to because it's kind of controversial. I think people have a bad view of palm oil, so I think it's a great one for us to really get under the hood of, really understand a bit more, and really give people the facts behind it, and I think some of the solutions as well. So let's get stuck into that. But before we do that, let's start with hearing a little bit about yourself, your career, and why do you know more than most people about palm oil?
Well, thanks very much for that introduction. And I quite like the name geek. I call myself a palm oil nerd. That doesn't sound as nice. So yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I mean, my career was nothing to do with palm oil, nothing to do with oils and fats. I actually started off in the hospitality sector and was working incredibly long hours in hotel management, and ended up going back to college, which then led me into working for a food wholesaler. And then the journey progressed that I got into food manufacturing. And I've literally been in gatter manufacturing, in fish production, sandwich production. I actually worked for Ubiquity at one point. So I was in particularly working within their whole range of different products. I've worked for Dutch companies, vegetarian companies. Really diverse. And then I had a family and tried to balance looking after kids and working full time. And to cut a long story short, I took 3 years out. And after 3 years, my husband was desperate that I went back to work. And my sort of background was sales and marketing, so not an environmentalist. But part of that was that I did a lot of work within retailer, and I actually ran my own development team for one of the companies that I worked for to face up to work with retailers. So long story short, I'm looking for a marketing role so that I can be home based. And I find that companies advertising for a temporary marketing manager at AAK, which is an oils and fats company, very close to where I live. And I arrived and they had this product called palm oil. And it was like, what's that? And as I arrived, they were basically, the management team there were working with retailers, WWF, Save the Children, to form the RSPO. And after that, the rest is history. And that's how it all started, working in palm oil.
Great. Well, it sounds as though, I think like most of us, we have quite a diverse career before we get to the point that we find ourselves at. But yeah, great to hear that background. So let's get into palm oil, because you mentioned a couple of things there like RSPO. People might not know that's the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. We'll get onto all that later on because I think that's a great one to call out. But yes, like I say, I was looking forward to palm oil because I think it's pretty controversial. I think people have heard a lot of things about palm oil, which, let's face it, are pretty accurate. Things like deforestation. There's been pushback from charities, NGOs and others on big companies that are using palm oil and quite rightly holding them to account to make sure that their palm oil is sourced sustainably and things like that. But before we get into all of those things, I think it would be great for people to understand what is palm oil, because people might think of a palm tree. Is it coming from a palm tree? People might think, well, that was coconuts, surely, that we're chopping out of palm trees. So maybe you can just touch on what exactly palm oil is, what it looks like, and why has it been so popular? Why is it that such a huge industry in palm oil is there? What's the benefits behind it?
Okay. So palm oil does come from a tree, but actually the tree is a grass, but it grows to 25 meters in height. So originally it's a West African crop. And yes, it's a palm oil tree, as you can imagine. And then it has big fresh fruit bunches, which are about 25 kilograms to 30 kilograms in weight, with lots of tiny little fruits around it, which are about the size of a large olive or a plum. And I guess I'd like to start off with the point is that in Africa, this crop has been used for thousands of years. It was found in the Egyptian tombs because the Africans were extracting oil from it. They were using it for food and still use it for food. If you speak to anybody, they always talk about palm oil and they talk about the red palm oil. So they use it for frying and so on, but they were also using it as a basic cosmetic, as a moisturizer, simplistically. And that was first documented, sadly, in the slave trade when the palm fruits were actually put on the ships and they noticed that the slaves were rubbing their skin with it because their skin was so dry and, obviously, finding it really awful being on the ships. And the slave traders actually decided to use it on the slaves themselves when they actually got them to their point of sale because it made their skin look better. Horrible kind of story. But fast forward to 1860, and the British took it to Malaysia, and the Dutch took it to Indonesia. And in those countries, it was just found to grow really well. It was taken as an ornamental crop. And obviously, it could extract oil. It grew really well. So all of a sudden, you start to have an industry that's producing an oil. Think about population growth. Think about the Industrial Revolution. Think about versatility. And then you're suddenly producing an oil that can replace animal tallow. So again, perhaps think about when you think about palm oil, obviously it's an oil, but it can also be solid at room temperature. So again, you can use it where you would use animal tallow. And I think the best example would be Unilever bringing it into Liverpool to produce washing powders and soap. So again, in the 1800s, because you were washing your face in animal tallow before this, or before that, you could be using whale oil. So we've always wanted oil. So just have an awful habit of getting it from bad places. So we nearly made the whale extinct because we wanted oil for lamps. Anyway, palm oil just is a fantastic yielding. So when you think about oils and fats, and if you said, before I joined AAK, or even if I said to you, well, what is a vegetable oil? You'd probably think, well, I think it's sunflower, and I know this crop called rapeseed, so I think it's that. But actually, the big four are palm, soya, rape, and sunflower, and they're about 86% of the total volume of oils that we use in the world. That every country, places like the US is very dependent on soya oil. Canada produces rapeseed, Australia produces rapeseed, and in Europe, rapeseed and sunflower are very, very common. But driven by Industrial Revolution, the need for lubricants, the need for food source and frying. So everything you need of oil in, so plastics, printer inks, lubricants, can come from palm oil. And because it's this fantastic yielding crop, it grows all year round and you harvest it every 10 to 20 days. So whereas rapeseed and sunflower and soy can only be harvested once a year, palm oil is just ongoing. And plus, in this little fruit that's the size of an olive or a plum, it has a kernel in the middle, and the kernel can be crushed to produce oil. So not only does the oil come from the fruit, which is red, which is where you get red palm oil. So if you're ever down the retail aisle and you're looking at specialty oils, you will see red palm oil in a very fancy bottle, and it is that very deep red orange color, and then the kernel is also then crushed and used. So that's a very whistle stop history tour, but I think it's really important to just, when people think about it, and I know we'll come on and talk about destruction of forests, is that we need oils and fats. We don't have a magic box where we go to and you think, oh yeah, that can make a tire, or that can make a piece of equipment. You know, we need minerals, we need plants such as rubber trees to produce rubber. And that's a really weird concept as well. So it's just thinking about the natural world and what we need to make all of those things that are everyday.
Yeah, I think it's really great. And, you know, I think you've done it such justice to hear about that history and how it's developed, because I think people need to hear, you know, that there are reasons behind why this crop has been so prevalent. And it's because it is such a wonder crop, even when you compare it to those other oils and fats that you talked about. You know, I can't, we'll flash this up on screen when we get the exact stat, but compared to the, you know, soy oil that you can get and other vegetable oils, you know, palm oil uses 1/10 the amount of land that's needed. Like you say, every 10 to 20 days you can get fruit from it. So it's no surprise that, you know, this wonder crop started replacing other fats and oils that were used. And then also lots more formats have been found that it can be used in. And maybe that would be a great place to go next, because I think people have a few different foods and areas of how they interact with products every day that they know or understand have palm oil in. But I think there's lots of products that they will have no idea are also touched by palm oil as well. So it'd be great if you could go through some of the classic ones that make up the consumption of palm oil, but maybe a few of the unusual ones that people wouldn't realize.
Yeah. So I think a very common place to find it is in a fish and chip shop, where if you because it's an oil that will put up with endless frying and heat. So if you go in a fish and chip shop, it's either beef dripping that's used, or palm oil. So yeah, that's kind of common way you might see it in, and then obviously within food. But the most uncommon places that you'd see that is because you can create derivatives from it, and also getting into the chemistry bit now, is that you've got the fatty acid chains. So these carbon chains that make up all oils and fats are needed to produce different types of products. So I think the best one I always love is in toilet roll. So why is it in toilet roll? Because if you buy the very flash stuff and it's got a moisturizer in it, it'll have a lotion in it that will contain a palm oil derivative in it. If you get up in the morning and you clean your teeth, it will be in toothpaste. It will be in the soap and the shampoo that you're using. And then it could well be in the moisturizers. So it's these derivatives, and or oleochemicals is the name that we would be using. And these, you could say, well, why can't we use something else? You just said sunflower and rapeseed. But it's the makeup of it, it's the chemistry of it that makes it that it can be used in these products. So typically, most cosmetics will have it in. And then you go into things like printer ink, where, you know, it would be in printer ink, it could be in plastics. And there was a big discussion a couple of years back about the banknotes. And so it started off with the £20 note. It has a plastic film over the top of it, and it has stearic acid in it. Now, the stearic acid is actually from beef, but the Bank of England knew that some religions were actually against handling the money because it had stearic acid in it, and stearic acid is present in palm oil. So there was a big discussion: do you use palm oil in the coating on a banknote? Well, the decision was not to do that in the end, but those are the places that it can be in. So yeah, in every food you can think about that wants a solid fat, or something like a chocolate where palm kernel, you can using that particularly in things like chocolate and cosmetics. So it's all about its chemistry and its diversity. I think the best one I've ever had was trying to work out whether or not it was in concrete. And big debate, was it in concrete? And actually, again, in this country, we use a plasticizer, which could be used. It helps the flow of concrete. It could be used in there, but we think it's castor oil. However, things like steel slag are put into concrete to bulk it out, if you like. But in places like Indonesia, they use the kernel. So when you've taken that nut off, you've got the kernel. They could use that type of product within things like concrete. So it's everywhere. And then I suppose the final one is biodiesel, because that again is a massive one where the choice between food and fuel, in places like Indonesia, they're going to go for a 50-50 split and putting palm oil in it. Again, in this country, a lot of vehicles, and again, you'll see them advertised, are using cooking oil. So again, it can be used as a waste stream, if you like, in things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you would, if you looked around the room now, wherever you're sitting, and I'm obviously sitting in a very scruffy office, I can see lens cleaner, I can see nail varnish, I've got hand sanitizer, I've got, I don't know, I've even got chewing gum on my desk, and I don't know whether or not that would have glycerin in it, which is probably derived from palm oil. So that's just very quickly looking around the room.
And I think this is so fascinating because, certain products and certain companies become the focus point of being a palm oil user, and therefore a lot of pushback, again, quite rightly, that people and companies need to, make sure that they're sustainably sourcing their palm oil, which we'll get onto the how behind that. But I think it's this realization of how much it goes into and how huge and how important a commodity is globally, in the fact that it goes into so many products. In fact, funny story myself, that I think I didn't make friends at a party a couple of years ago from speaking to someone saying, oh, we're a completely palm oil free household, and they'd removed a whole load of foods and things that they weren't buying anymore. And I had this awareness, at least, of toothpaste. And I said, so what are you cleaning your teeth with? And, I think quite quickly I was not going to be on their Christmas card list, because they kind of walked off very disappointed to find this out. But it is in so many different things, which is why the option to completely step away from it and not use it at all, I think, is a very challenging one for many people, if not impossible to go through their daily lives. Therefore, we need to get onto the topic of making it sustainable and resilient for the future, which we'll come on to. But maybe let's just keep with the industry a second. Let's think about the scale of this and also where most of it is coming from. Can you give a few numbers as to how much palm oil is being produced every year? I believe it's the number one vegetable oil by size, and also which are the key countries and markets that are producing this.
Okay, so it's roughly about 84 million tons of palm oil is produced every year. Indonesia and Malaysia are the two regions that are producing the most. About 85% of the crop will come from those countries / regions. And the biggest consumer is by far Indonesia itself. So it's the biggest grower and the biggest consumer. Other countries that do produce palm oil are India. So if you think it's all around the equator, it's that belt all around. So Colombia, South America, in general, Brazil, Argentina will have have crops there, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, and Thailand. So in terms of country size, it probably goes Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Ghana, and then the other countries make up the rest. But it's a lot smaller. But it's definitely, particularly Indonesia and Malaysia, where the forests were taken for timber, and also there was the use of plantations for rubber. So again, that's where palm oil was just an easy fit to either take the place of obviously the forest and the timber was taken, or moving into crops and moving from, say, rubber into palm oil, for an example.
That's really interesting to understand. And I think those geographies, and it's such a common thing, right? A lot of the materials that we're going to be talking about in this podcast series, the ideal growing conditions for a lot of things are, where it's slightly humid, good rainfall, but also heat as well. So that kind of central equator band of the world is certainly a vibrant place for lots of these things. So no surprise that palm oil's there as well. Let's talk a little bit about who's growing this as well. It'd be great to hear about the people behind the supply chain, and great to hear the sort of steps that it goes through in terms of being produced into an oil, and then all of the different things that we have. So firstly, what, are these farms, plantations, smallholders? Would be great to understand that mix, perhaps focusing on, the largest market there, like you said, Indonesia. And then once it is grown, if you could sort of walk us through the different steps and the different tiers in the supply chain that it goes through next.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, the palm oil industry is quite incestuous in the sense of there are some major growers, and they hold quite big percentages of the market, the traders. But when you strip that back and start looking by country, smallholders play a significant part, because it's a really easy crop to grow. You plant a tree, it grows, it produces fruit, and then you take the fruit down, and we'll talk a little bit about the supply chain in a minute. So it's really easy for a smallholder to be able to do that. And because it's harvested every 10 to 20 days, again, it's a continuous crop, so it's incredibly profitable. So Indonesia, in particular, gave land to smallholders. So in Indonesia, it's about 45%, about 40% in Malaysia. In places like Thailand, it's as high as 80% is produced by smallholders. Colombia is a slightly different story, quite a mix of smallholders and larger growers. But one of the drivers behind that is that the government there is very keen to get smallholders involved, so they don't grow cocaine, for an example, because obviously for them, that's is a very highly profitable crop. So they're very much about trying to encourage legal crops rather than go in that direction. So there's been some fantastic stories coming out of Colombia about smallholder support and about it making a difference. Touching on smallholders, you would say that smallholders are 40% of the total market or producing market. They tend to be on farms that are less than 50 hectares. They can be as small as 2 hectares. 2 hectares, I would say, or at least a hectare is a rugby pitch or a football pitch. So again, they can be in very remote areas. They can be on hillsides. They can be certainly butting up to tropical forests. So smallholders can sometimes be growing palm trees, and they could be growing other crops as well. So again, it's a real mixture about what people do, and also it could be that smallholders would be growing palm and, say, rubber. So they've got small plantations. I mean, in Thailand in particular, they have plantations of maybe a hectare or so of palm trees, and then they'll be growing fruit. That's again. So they are quite a mix. So it's the key message here is it's an easy crop and it's profitable. Then you get the big players. So people who have bought land. I mean, again, interesting, some of the names out there. So Wilmar might be somebody that if you're not in the industry, you'll think Wilmar, I've never heard of them. But they're probably about 42% of the market. You get companies such as SD Guthrie, or was commonly known as Sime Darby. And that was literally Mr. Sime and Mr. Darby, who went to Malaysia and started planting palm trees and grew an industry out of that. And then there is a whole range of Cargill is another one where across commodity in again, the biggest private, I think it's American-based family business, again within palm oil. So you get these massive players and then smaller players, some of them very much colonial. Others obviously come from countries of origin. And they can have, miles upon miles on miles of plantations. They have to work in sort of a round mill. So they have like a 50-kilometer radius. So again, imagine, this is more as well thinking about the history, because as things develop, road networks develop. So say in the early 90s, when palm oil really took off, and it took off because the West didn't want to have trans fats in its diet. So we can maybe explore that in health, but trans fats was a key driver for the use of palm oil. So there's suddenly a big market for it, a lot more interest in it. So people started planting palm trees, and certainly this is when the destruction of the rainforest really began to kick off. So you have people in quite remote areas that have got a dirt track, and when it rains and it floods and they can't get it moved out very fast. They need to be close to the mill. Why? Because the fresh fruit bunch, when you see it, it's really solid. I mean, it's like you could almost hit it. It's not squishy or anything. It's just a really solid, and it's sort of like this. It's really heavy to pick up, but it will, as soon as it lands on the floor. Trees will start off at, literally, it is just a small plant. Just think about a household plant. It starts that size, and then it grows and grows up to 25 meters in height, and they cut it down. And as the fruit falls, it gets damaged like an apple would, where it starts to oxidize. So you only have 48 hours to get it to the mill before the oil actually starts to go off. So what happens then is the mills are in a 50-kilometer radius, because that's roughly the absolute extreme these people can work to get it to the mill. The kernel in the middle is different because it's a nut. It doesn't go off. So they're more interested in getting the fruit separated off the bunch, get the kernel out of the fruit and press the fruit, and then the kernel can go somewhere else. Fast forward to where we are now in 2025. I think I went about 10 years ago to Malaysia, and I was fascinated to be taken out to a plantation, and through driving past the housing estates that, could look like anywhere in the UK, Barratt, Persimmon, kind of, whoever is your local builder. And they said, oh yeah, this used to be palm oil, but of course, we've taken it for housing. So again, that's the other thing. Road networks are improving. So now this 50-kilometer radius can be up to 100 kilometers, because the roads are so good. They're dual carriageways, they're motorways. So it really is dependent on how remote it is and so on, about how fast you get it to the mill. The point about smallholders, they tend to live in really distant places. So Indonesia's got the biggest problem, where you could spend 9 hours driving on a dirt track. That's how again, not one thing fits all. So that's really, so smallholders have to get it to a mill, and they're often dependent on dealers who come round and literally buy it off them at the farm gate, and they'll come round every 2 or 3 days and they'll take it. The bigger plantations have massive trucks, proper equipment that can, drive the fruit to the mill. So that's it's very, very different. And even 2025, you're seeing poverty, flooding, not being able to get it to certain places, people going on the backs of motorbikes almost with these fresh fruit bunches or trucks, compared to really sophisticated equipment and tractors and, almost not like cherry pickers, but, it's that kind of, they put it down with a sickle and they're picking it up with farm equipment, rather than literally physically having to pick it up and put it almost in wheelbarrows. So very, very diverse till it gets to the mill. And that's the sort of that sort of bit of the supply chain.
Yeah, no, really, really fascinating. I also find it fascinating just, how industries like this just form the geographies that we see in everyday life. I mean, we've done an episode in this series on the milk industry in the UK, and of course, interesting to see that, where would you put a dairy? Well, you drop it bang in the middle of lots and lots of dairy fields, so that you can get the product, from the cows quite literally as quickly as possible to the dairy. And it seems very similar in palm oil, but I did find that interesting a few years ago when I found out that, within hours of the fruit bunch dropping from the tree, speed is of the essence because people need to get it there because it doesn't have the shelf life. You take a week to get it to the mill for it to be crushed and squeezed and, to have the oil extracted from the fruit. You can't wait a week because, like you said, within a couple of days it starts to rot, which means that looking at the road networks and things like that, generally these mills, which is the next step in the supply chain, are going to be in close proximity, almost like a bullseye in the middle of the area where they're going to be, getting their inputs of the palm fruit. Yeah, really, really, really interesting. You touched on a couple of challenges there already to being a palm oil smallholder or, one of these larger companies, but it is profitable. It is a sort of wonder crop for many reasons. Is its demand increasing? Have we seen the numbers increase in terms of the demand and the production of palm oil, or is it going down, competing with other things? Would be great to hear the dynamics of the industry and what it looks like moving forward.
Yeah, so palm oil is on the increase. Probably in 2015, it was about 65 million tons. It's expected to grow. It's not driven by Europe, and I'll include the UK into Europe. That has significantly dropped because Europe has decided to take palm oil out of biodiesel. So it was up to 9 million tons, about 13% of the production was going to be to Europe. That's now declining, and it's roughly about 3 million tons. In the UK, it's been fairly flat. You'd say the UK uses between 450,000 tons to maybe 480,000 tons. Certainly this year, we'd expect it to be about 440 tons. But then you compare it to India, and India, so if, say the UK is using 450,000 tons per year, India is using 480,000 tons per month. So the demand in India and China, so it's Indonesia, India, China, and then after that, you're starting to get countries like Bangladesh or Japan or Saudi Arabia are all starting to use far more palm oil. So the European market is, oh, we don't want it, causes deforestation, got really bad image of it. And yet it's in everything that we touch. But because we don't know it's in these earlier chemicals, because again, think about oil. What do you want? Animal, mineral, or vegetable? So as soon as you go into vegetable, you're into one of those four that I mentioned before. In America, it's slightly different because they use soya, and they also have access to cotton. So cotton seed oil, can you believe it? You grind seeds in cotton, and you get cottonseed oil. They will use that. So the palm oil market is still seen in its infancy within America. And the other thing is in America, they are not as bothered by trans fats, although Obama did actually have put legislation in place to ban trans fats. So when you hydrogenate something, so this is an important factor in food. So something like palm oil can be a solid. So a solid is a fat. So you have palm oil fat, which is equal to, say, butter, lard, those types of things. And then you have liquids, so your rapeseed and your sunflower and your olive oil. But the performance of the rapeseed and olive oil, etc., you cannot make a cake out of that. Or you could domestically, but not on manufacturing scale. So you want to have a solid fat. If you're going to make these liquids into solids, you would hydrogenate it. So again, anyone that's in the food industry will remember hydrogenation. So you basically you pumping it with hydrogen to make it solid. And then say for palm oil, because it's a solid at room temperature, and you can fractionate it, which is a piece that we've not talked about. You can split the liquid bit off from the solid, so you don't have to hydrogenate it. So you are trans-free. Now, hydrogenation is made in food has gone out of fashion big style, and so you wouldn't necessarily see it in Europe. But just to go back to the demand, palm oil is trans-free, so it's not. I don't want to say it's healthier because it's a 50-50 saturates and unsaturates compared to, say, rapeseed. But it does mean that you have so much more versatility within food. And then population growth, think of India in particular, then think of multiple uses, cosmetics, using biodiesel particular, and the fact that there's a view that it might be used in aviation fuel. In answer to your question, yes, palm oil is increasing at a fair rate.
Wow, it really sounds like it. I think it's just interesting for people to know that, I think it puts even more impetus on the fact that there needs to be a sustainable and resilient path for this moving forward, because I can't see the world moving away from palm oil anytime soon. And from what you've explained, it's only going to increase in demand with the number of products that it can be used in to service only a growing global population. And I think you touched on a few of the countries there with really expanding populations in the world and expanding consumer markets too. So I think that is the route moving forward. Let's get into the challenges. You touched on a few there. This is why it's controversial. This is why it's got such a bad name. And I would say quite rightly, because there have been some challenges there, of course, and we need to go through them. I'll tell a story of my experience from this. And I think we'll touch on the challenge with deforestation and things. So many years ago, working for Nestle in the UK, I think it was just a month before I started for them, there was the big incident with, I think, a couple of guys from Greenpeace dressed in orangutan outfits that were climbing the Nestle office to put up a banner, and there was this big pushback on palm oil. So that was probably my first experience and awareness of palm oil. And then, of course, working in Nestle and then on to other companies that have been a user of palm oil, I've obviously found out more and more about it. But I think that did a great job of highlighting the challenge and the issue. If people ever saw that, there were some videos and advertisements coming out, sort of a play on a chocolate bar advert with orangutans. And of course, this scene of devastation of a rainforest or forest being cleared. And of course, the heart-wrenching visuals of orangutans and other animals, of course, losing their homes. And that's before we even get onto the topic of why, rainforests and forests in general are so important for the climate and for capturing carbon in the atmosphere. But it's not just deforestation, right? There are lots of others. Maybe you could go through and talk about the challenges that are seen in the palm oil industry and highlighted very well.
Yeah, so I mean, deforestation was massive in Indonesia and Malaysia because if you like, these are the jewels in the crown where the forests are, and that's the same within Brazil. So once destruction happens, and particularly for the orangutan that only lives in Indonesia and Malaysia, it was horrific scenes. And I totally agree with you. But there was, I think, probably a point in the 90s when people were saying we could see that palm oil is going to increase at such a rate. What we're going to do about it? And that was when everybody came together to form the RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. So deforestation, there's nothing you can say. It has happened. It still continues to happen, but it's tending to happen in other crops away from palm oil. I'm not saying palm oil is squeaky clean. It's not, but it's really, the brakes are on. However, also within palm oil, it has been, so not only did you lose carbon by destruction of trees, but you were also, particularly in Malaysia, planting into peatland. So you were wrecking the forest, and then obviously the carbon was coming off the peatland. And it's not actually that good to grow palm oil trees in peat. They don't really do that well, and also you're subject to flooding. So exposure of peatland and the release of greenhouse gas emissions was another area of concern. Also, when you're growing palm oil trees and you're using fertilizers, you can often get runoff into the rivers. So rivers got polluted, and then it kills the fish. I mean, we experienced that in Europe as well, so you can well imagine it happening there. And then other things where, when land was being cleared, the tendency to use fire to clear land. So you take the timber, you've got all of this rough left, whatever's left, and you want to give it a base where you get rid of all of the rubbish, basically. But you're also wanting to change the acidity of the soil. So people set alight the land. But unfortunately, because it's often peat, again, we've got this the same experience in Europe. Once it's alight, it's really difficult to put it out. So again, 2015, there was a massive fires, and smog went as far as Singapore. So people in Singapore couldn't see, I mean, it was just horrendous, and pollution. And I think there was something like 100,000 deaths, premature deaths caused in the region through these forest fires. So fire was also a huge thing. And then you come on to actual workers. So let's start off with the kind of workers that work in a plantation. So it's pretty hard work, and it's very manual, and the plantations are miles from anywhere. So the fruit itself is often collected by men, but they would also bring their families. And places like Malaysia, again, like in countries in Europe, nobody who is Malaysian is that bothered about working in the plantation. So migrant labour is less so now because of COVID, but people were coming from Bangladesh and other regions to come and work in the plantation. So you've got workers in the middle of nowhere with families, often speaking multiple languages, often not native to the country. And particularly where there were families, if you've got no childcare, you're going to take the children into the plantation, because the women will go in and follow some of the workers because they can pick up the loose fruit. So that would be helpful, because it tends to be men, because of the weight of these bloody things. Although, as I've said, I have seen particularly in Malaysia, women working in the field and laughing at me personally trying to pick things up. Just imagine all of that, the tourist trap. But so women would go in, pick up the loose fruit. So children are then involved. They're helping, because a worker gets paid on what they pick, not a salary, not a day rate. It's what you pick. Yeah. And if you're doing a 10-hectare plot and trying to get around it all, that's one thing. The other thing is that women tend to be looking after the seedlings. or spraying and using fertilizer lighter work. So again, you've got this issue where they've got no protective clothing. So again, we've had evidence about women, spraying things and becoming blind, and obviously pregnant women or breastfeeding women using chemicals without any protective clothing. So, and then the final bit just around migrant workers is, again, this is more Malaysian than Indonesia, but in Malaysia, it's very common for people to pay a fee to find a job. So you would pay an agency to find you a job, and then you would owe that agency the money till you could pay it back. Equally, where they went to the plantations, they might innocently take your passport because, there's no way to keep it, it's not safe, it's valuable, we'll keep it. So there was a lot of views that there was a lot of modern day slavery going on. And I think that in some cases it was very innocent because a fee had been charged and somebody owed it and somebody got the passport taken away, to the other extreme, which was exploitation of workers and the plantations and passports being kept. People were trapped. And then I guess the final bit on migrant workers, if you've got a family, again, local laws don't always allow you to access education. So that's the mother feeder why a child would be at home and outside education. So those are kind of the problems that have been the challenge over the last few years, and where the main focus of particularly RSPO has been about trying to stop that actually happening.
Yeah, it's so interesting to go through all of those challenges because, like with every crop supply chain, it's not just one challenge. There are multiple, and so there's not one silver bullet that's gonna really solve it. But we'll come on to some of the areas of work that have been done to solve that. Just picking up on one thing you obviously mentioned there around migrants. Again, I think there's parallels and similarities with lots of other crops, lots of other supply chains. This issue where you talk about workers in the supply chain, as soon as you're a migrant worker, so you're not native of that country, there can be very different laws within that country. Therefore, you're not protected in certain ways, whether that's labour laws or any others. And even you touched on there, access to education as well, which only exacerbates the problem. So really interesting to hear all of those and for people to be really clear on those, because I think a lot of people rightly would have heard about deforestation. It's a big one, of course, but there are lots more happening in what is a very large industry. So let's talk about some of the solutions, or at least some of the work that's been put in place to try and find a more sustainable path for palm oil. You've mentioned a couple of times there RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. It'd be great to hear how that started, what that is, and probably from a consumer perspective, how might they see it or come across it on their products?
So as you said, the RSPO Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil only came into being in 2005, and basically set a standard for the mills and its supply base to be audited to. And throughout the last every 5 years, that principles and criteria, that standard has been developed. So you now have a very clear, strict policy where you have no deforestation, cut-off date in 2018. You have workers' rights, you have no child labour, living income, not being able to take passports, basically trying to improve the crop and how it's farmed, no runoffs near rivers, some levels of compensation for Indigenous people, looking at the legality of it. So the industry is being transformed with some of that work from an RSPO point of view. And it's also important to note that many of the growers that were involved with RSPO can't certify all of their mills and their supply bases to RSPO for a variety of different reasons, but they have also implemented no deforestation policies, and they've also implemented a lot of social policies. And also RSPO is very focused on smallholders and trying to bring them into the fold. So what you've got is 2005, this is looking pretty bad. And fast forward to 2025, you're seeing an industry which is full of positive, it's got great controls, it's a safer place to work, it's got transparency, it's got traceability, and the other standard that has been introduced goes from the mill right through the supply chain, which is the supply chain certification standard. So what is interesting is a consumer very rarely will see any reference to RSPO because consumers are still outraged by palm oil. So most manufacturers don't want to mention palm oil, and they certainly don't want to use the logo. And there's a whole strict regime of how you can make claims and so on. So from what is quite sad is that so much work has been done, and yet you can't see it on pack, can't make that choice. Now, many manufacturers would say, well, if I'm making, Kit Kat, the story of Nestle, I've got chocolate, I've got palm oil, I've got wheat in there, and I've got sugar. Which bit of the sustainable story do I need to tell? And so I have to have a responsible sourcing policy for everything I do. And therefore, that's what I'm going to talk about. My responsible sourcing, of which RSPO will play a role within that. So yeah, that's almost the sad thing is that the industry has been transformed. I mean, particularly in smallholders, is that a lot of young people, and again, I think this is something so relatable to people sitting in Europe. There's a lot of young people are now going to university. They've been allowed to get an education, so they've gone to university, and they're not going to do what mum and dad do, which is work in a plantation. They've no interest in doing that. So actually, what they do is that they're starting to buy land. So they employ people to work on these very small farms. And one of my colleagues was in the back of a taxi. He was driving to go see a rubber plantation. And it was kind of like 9 hours of the driving. So to pass the time, he obviously started talking to the taxi driver. And the taxi driver said, he's sort of saying something about palm oil. And the taxi driver said, oh yeah, I've got 2 plantations. And so my colleague said, what do you mean you've got 2 plantations? Yeah, well, I've got 2 hectares here and 3 hectares there. And that's what I do the taxi driving for, because I'm buying land and then I employ people to actually work the palm oil and I make money out of that, and it works for my local community. So you're seeing not only the classic poverty-stricken smallholder that's in, a really remote place, whose kids don't have shoes and they don't have access to a dentist and they struggle with healthcare, to the complete opposite of some plantations quite close to cities or major residential areas where people are employing others, to farm their land for them. So the extreme of the smallholder and, the ability to see that, use the internet. I mean, that's the other thing. It's one of the biggest problems that palm oil's got is those that get left behind don't have proper internet connection because they can't, get the geolocations, or they can't communicate with people in the same way. They can't find the best information. So, yeah, it's so diverse. And the RSPO, as I've said, is really leading the way with these standards. And particularly with new regulations, have done an awful lot to bring traceability and recognition of what happens on the ground. So in particular, I'm just working on a project now for one of my clients, which is to trace from the supermarket shelf right through to a mill. So I've now got the mill list, which is, it's quite narrow, the mill list. And now what we're going to do is investigate what those mills are doing by looking at the RSPO reports. And there might come a little bit of using AI when possible to try and analyze it, because each report's about 150 pages long. But that's the difference now about what we can see the attitudes. And it's also, I just go to child labour. I mean, it's really difficult for a woman if you've got little children and you need to go do something, you take them with you. And sometimes that can be a dangerous place to go. But it is, it's the kind of thing that I would have done. And then the other side of it, it's I've got two sons. So would I have not said when they were teenagers, well, why don't you go and help your father then? Go get this because he's going to be working really late. Why would you not go? So I think we've just got to sometimes think of it as we do need to move everyone in the right direction to be kind and compassionate and have equal laws in Europe and in places like Indonesia or Thailand, but also having sympathy to what's happening locally. I'm not suggesting child labour is okay, but I'm just trying to put it in that context of, educating people or giving people access to education and to healthcare allows them to see the world in a different way, which I think is, if you like, the big success story of where it is today. And yeah, the saddest thing is consumers are not interested or I don't see it. I don't want to see it, I guess.
Yeah, I think you make some really interesting points there. I think the first one on child labour, I completely agree with you. I myself grew up in a farming community in the UK. A lot of my friends were farmers, and what did they do after school? Very regularly they would help out with the harvest or other jobs. That is part of it. And is that seen as child labour? Well, it's a child doing some labour depending on their age and where the cutoff is, as your class as a child in different countries. That is very different. I'm not saying it's right, but it's also very different to some of the extreme cases of child labour where it is a child forced away from their families, working in a factory somewhere, doing small, dangerous jobs. So, I think this is why it's really important that people understand, listen to podcasts like this, understand, the full story behind some of these materials. And then the second point I want to pick up on, I completely agree with you as well. I think it goes back to my story about the people at the party, people saying that they're wanting to remove palm oil from their lives and from the products that they purchase. I have probably seen someone that's more aware of palm oil. I have probably seen more packaged food or products that state palm oil free. So they're actively telling you it doesn't have any palm oil in, than those packs and packaging that I've seen with the RSPO logo, which I will flash up for people so they know what it is. But it's a palm tree logo in a sort of circular emblem, which, as you've explained, so much work goes in behind that to, audit and check on the provenance and the standards that are being met around deforestation, health and safety, other topics around where that palm oil comes from. And I think, going back to the start of when you talk through the numerous amount of products that do have palm oil in, I think this is why people don't know, because, like you say, brands and companies know that palm oil has such a bad name that they don't want to actively promote and explain to consumers that it does have palm oil in, even if they themselves as a company are sourcing their palm oil through sustainable routes like the RSPO. So a really challenging dynamic that we have there, and something that I think needs to change if we want people to be more aware and to support more the palm oil industry. Judith, we can't leave it without talking about the EUDR, which is the European Union Deforestation Regulation. Sorry for people to get technical at the end of this podcast, but the reason I say we can't leave it is because it's so timely, because literally, I think minutes before we came on to record this podcast, and maybe you can explain what the EUDR is, there was a report and a update that has gone like wildfire through the industry to talk about a delay to this regulation being put in place. So let's maybe finish there, because I think it's another point around, and an example, however challenging, that certain markets and countries are also trying to tackle the deforestation issue.
Yeah. So the EUDR, in answer to the Paris Agreement and other COPs, launched a regulation that stopped any deforestation entering Europe based on 7 commodities, which include palm oil, it could be cattle, cocoa, coffee, timber, soya, and rubber. And it was supposed to come in December 24. The idea is that you need to give geolocations right down to a polygon, and a polygon is something that is about 4 hectares in size. So thinking of all the things that we've said in this last hour about people trying to give coordinates and give traceability and due diligence and how difficult that is. So it was always huge burden, and people have moved massively in the industry to try to comply. It was due to come in December 2025. And the way that the EU was going to run it, and still could, is to have a IT platform. So before you put the product on the market, you've got to enter it into this IT platform. And literally today, just as I was preparing, I was getting texts saying, is it on? Is it on? And I'm like, is the EUDR up? What are you talking about? And it was literally just hit now to say that the EU is now saying that the IT platform, they don't think can cope with this range of commodities coming into Europe at all these different levels, all these, different components. So, I mean, palm oil is relatively simple compared to timber. So to just give you an idea on timber, they go so far as to say that you have to report on things like broom handles and anything that's made from wood, whereas palm oil is palm oil itself and palm kernel and some earlier chemicals. So it's just spitting off more than it can chew, and now it's suggesting it's not going to go ahead. Now, it still could go ahead, but the big thing for me is the people that are really doing the belly aching, I use that expression, it's mainly the Europeans, it's the European farmers that are set, because they have to also adhere to this. And actually, countries such as Malaysia is all set to go. Indonesia has just literally announced its trade deal today as well with Europe to be able to comply and give all of the coordinates and do all these different things as within all this. And they're just sort of saying now the IT platform's not going to go ahead. To me, it's outrageous. It's the European market demanding that you behave like this, and this is what we insist on. And the small cocoa farmers, smallholders, have been desperately trying to get ready. Coffee farmers the same. Smallholders within the palm oil plantations been excluded. We have evidence of that because they couldn't get the right information. It's affecting their livelihoods. It really is a political disaster if the EU do this. Will it affect deforestation? I'm not sure, because I think it's global. I think it has to come globally, and Europe is not the biggest consumer of palm oil, in particular, different for cocoa and coffee, because I think it's about 60% of the cocoa crop goes through Europe, whereas palm oil is, I don't know, was 7%. I bet it's as low as sort of 3-4% now. But yeah, and it's a really sad day, and a lot of people pulling their hair out. And yeah, I'm glad I'm glad I'm not in the European Commission.
Yeah, I should think it's a tasty place to be right now. I'm sure.
It is.
Judith, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. Maybe we can finish just with some words from you. Hopefully people have taken the first step by listening to a podcast like this to think, yeah, I want to learn more about palm oil and maybe some other materials they've listened to. Because I think that is the whole ethos of the podcast, is to get experts like you or geeks to come and speak to people, because I don't think people are exposed to this enough, and to really understand the journeys and the people behind the materials and the products that they consume every day. So just to finish, what would you really like people to take away from the conversation today?
I just think have a bit more understanding of what things are made from, and that they do come from nature. And if it does come from nature, how does it affect our planet and therefore our climate? And oils and fats are not just, are what we need in everyday life. And palm oil is not, has had a bad journey. It has got a bad press, but it is needed for the world's population. So support it and drive the sustainable product. And if we can, ask for RSPO sustainable palm oil, because it does make a difference and it has made a difference.
Thank you so much. What a great place to finish. Thank you for doing this. You've always been an absolute pleasure to work with. You're so knowledgeable on this topic, but also really pragmatic, because you've been there, done it, been in, on the ground in Indonesia, been in the palm oil mills. You get how it works and what the solutions really are, and also see through the challenges that there are there as well. So thank you so much for today. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.